It wasn't supposed to end like this. When Emily first mentioned Rachel's party, I barely gave it a thought. We'd been married long enough for me to know her routine. A night out with friends, maybe some drinks, maybe some dancing. It had never been a big deal, but this time, something felt off. There was a casualness in her tone, a distance in her eyes, and Rachel's reputation for those kinds of parties. It just didn't sit right. Lately, Emily had been pulling away. Late nights, vague excuses. I wasn't jealous, not this time. It was more than that. It was a quiet, gnawing realization that something between us was slipping away. And no matter what I did, I couldn't stop it. The night before the party, I tried to talk to her. "I don't think you should go," I said, doing my best to keep my voice steady. "It's not about trust, but something doesn't feel right." Her reaction was sharper than I expected. "You're being paranoid again," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "It's Rachel's party, not some stranger's. Why do you always do this?" The word "always" hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I wasn't the kind of husband who was always checking up on her, and she knew that. But lately, it felt like I was holding on to something that was already gone. "I'm not trying to control you, Emily," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. "I'm telling you how I feel. I think we need to talk about this." She rolled her eyes, brushing me off as if my concerns meant nothing. "Talk about what? That I'm going to a party with my friends?" But it wasn't just the party. It was everything. The late nights, the quiet between us when we were alone. It felt like I was losing her, even if I didn't want to admit it. Maybe I was already too tired of the fights, too tired of being the only one trying to save something that felt like it was unraveling piece by piece. So when she left that night, I didn't stop her, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave. The silence in the house became suffocating. By midnight, the anxiety gnawed at me. No calls, no texts, just silence. I opened the tracking app on my phone. The one we'd installed after she kept losing her phone. It felt invasive, wrong, but I needed to know. I needed to put my mind at ease. But when her location popped up, my stomach dropped. Cedarview Motel. I stared at the screen, my thoughts racing. A motel? What the hell was she doing there? I drove faster than I should have. Each mile felt like an eternity, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The closer I got, the more I wanted to turn around, to believe there was some innocent explanation. But deep down, I knew. I knew before I even parked my car in the shadows, away from her line of sight. The motel was exactly what I expected. Cheap, discreet, perfect for secrets. I hesitated outside room 214. Her car was tucked away, hidden like she didn't want anyone to know. My heart pounded in my chest, the dull roar of blood rushing in my ears as I raised my hand to knock. I could hear them inside. Her laugh, his voice, low and indistinct. Rage surged through me. I knocked harder, my fist trembling with anger. When she finally opened the door, her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. Her hair was a mess, her makeup smudged, and in that moment, she didn't look like the woman I'd loved for years. She looked like a stranger. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for words that wouldn't come. She glanced over her shoulder at the man sitting on the edge of the bed, half-dressed and looking just as stunned as she was. His presence hit me like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't let my emotions overtake me. "Not yet. What the hell are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice barely above a hiss, as if she still believed she could control this moment, contain the damage. Her eyes darted around, scanning the parking lot for any witnesses. I didn't care who saw. I wasn't thinking about the fallout, the scene I was making. "What am I doing here? What are you doing here, Emily?" I shoved the door open wider, stepping inside before she could block me. The room reeked of cheap cologne and sweat. The bed, rumpled and used, stood like a monument to everything I hadn't wanted to believe. My fists clenched, but the anger that coursed through me wasn't the explosive kind. It was cold, hard. It settled in my chest like a block of ice. "Please," she said, stepping toward me, her hands up like she could somehow soothe me with a gesture. "This isn't what it looks like." Her voice trembled now, losing its edge. The man remained silent, cowardly, as if hoping I wouldn't notice him sitting there, his guilt so obvious it made my skin crawl. I didn't bother acknowledging him. He wasn't the problem. She was. I laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what it is." She reached out, her fingers brushing against my arm. "Let me explain," she pleaded, but I pulled away, disgusted by her touch, by the betrayal that now clung to her like a second skin. "Explain what, Emily?" My voice was cold, devoid of the emotion I had once poured into this marriage. You're in a motel room with him." Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment I wondered if they were real. Could she possibly feel guilty? Or was she just afraid of what this meant for her, for the life she had so carefully curated? "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice cracking as she took another step closer, desperation creeping into her words. "I didn't think it would get this far." Those words hit me harder than anything else she could have said. "Get this far?" I echoed, my laugh sharp and jagged. "You've been lying to me for months, and you didn't think it would get this far." Her eyes darted back to the man, who was still silent, staring at the floor, as if that would somehow absolve him of his part in this. But he wasn't the point. Emily was. She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, her makeup smudging further. "It wasn't like that at first. I was confused. I didn't know how to fix things between us." The memories came flooding back. Late night dinners where we barely spoke. Her distant eyes when I asked about her day. The quiet that had settled between us like a thick fog. How long had I been lying to myself, thinking we could fix this, that it was just a phase? How long had I ignored the truth? I shook my head, not out of disbelief, but exhaustion. "You've been cheating on me for months, Emily. Months. And now you're telling me you didn't think it would get this far." Her hands trembled as she reached for me again, her voice pleading, softer now, more desperate. "I'll end it. I swear. I'll end it with him. This was a mistake. Please, we can fix this." I stared at her, the woman I had loved for so many years, the woman I had built my life around. But this person standing in front of me wasn't the same. She had made her choice long before this night. She had made it the first time she met him, the first time she lied to me, the first time she decided I wasn't enough. "I'm done, Emily." My voice was quiet now, all the fight gone from me. I was drained. "There's nothing left to fix." She blinked, the reality of my words sinking in, and for the first time, I saw her break. Not in guilt, not in regret for what she had done, but in the fear of losing everything she had taken for granted. She opened her mouth to protest, but I didn't let her. "You made your choice," I said, my voice steady. "It's over." Her eyes filled with tears again, and this time they looked real. She whispered, "I didn't mean for this to happen," like it was a mantra, like saying it over and over would somehow erase the last few months of lies and betrayal. I glanced at the man again, still sitting there, still silent, still hoping to disappear, pathetic. Emily moved in closer, her voice cracking. "I love you. I do. We've been through so much. Please don't let it end like this." I took a deep breath, letting her words wash over me, but I felt nothing, not anymore. The love I had for her had withered long before this night. She had killed it slowly, with every lie, every secret, every moment she had chosen someone else over me. "There's nothing left," I said, turning toward the door. "You destroyed it." She stepped back, defeated, and as I left, I didn't look back. The cool night air hit me as soon as I stepped outside, and with it came a wave of relief. Not joy, not anger, but a quiet, unexpected relief. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest lifted, the doubt, the suspicion, the endless wondering. It was all gone. I had my answer now, and strangely, that was enough. The drive home felt longer than it should have. The streetlights blurred into thin streaks of yellow as I sped down the empty roads. The night too quiet, too still. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Emily running after me, calling out, begging me to come back. But she wasn't there. She was still in that motel room, and that's where I had left her, along with everything else we had built together. I should have been angry, but I wasn't. Not anymore. The anger had burned out, leaving behind something colder, numbness. Maybe that was what surprised me most, the confrontation, the betrayal, everything I had feared for months. It had finally happened, but instead of the fiery rage or heartbreak, there was just emptiness. I pulled into the driveway, staring at the house that now felt like a stranger's. The lights were off, the windows dark, but the memories still flickered inside. The time we painted the walls together, arguing over colors, laughing when we both ended up covered in splatters of green and blue. The first dinner we had in the kitchen, sitting on the floor because we hadn't bought chairs yet. We were so sure back then, so sure we had forever. I got out of the car, the cool night air brushing against my skin. The house loomed in front of me, but it didn't feel like home anymore. I used to come back to this place after long days at work, relieved to see her waiting for me, the faint smell of her perfume lingering in the hallway. Now, the thought of stepping inside made my stomach turn. I stood there for a moment, the keys heavy in my hand. Part of me wanted to leave, just get back in the car and drive somewhere, anywhere, but my feet wouldn't move, not yet. Eventually, I forced myself up the steps, the wooden boards creaking under my weight. The door clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud for the stillness of the night. The house swallowed me whole, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I tossed my keys onto the counter and stood in the kitchen, listening to the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence I had known before, the comfortable kind, when we would sit together, reading or watching TV, not needing to fill the space with words. This silence was different. It was thick, suffocating, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I walked to the fridge, grabbed a beer, and collapsed onto the couch. The leather felt cold against my skin, unfamiliar. I took a long swig, the bitterness of the beer settling in my chest like a stone. I wasn't angry. I wasn't heartbroken. I was just tired. The beer bottle clinked as I set it down on the table, my eyes drifting to the wall across from me. The pictures were still there, our wedding day, vacations, birthdays. I stared at them, trying to summon the feelings they once held, but they were just images now. They felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. The couple in those pictures wasn't us anymore. They were two people who had believed in something that had already crumbled beneath them. I leaned back, closing my eyes, letting the memories wash over me. The first time I'd realized something was wrong, it was months ago. She had come home late again, her excuses thin, barely believable. I'd asked her if everything was all right, if she was happy, and she had smiled at me, but her eyes told a different story. I had let it slide, telling myself it was just a rough patch, that we would figure it out like we always had. But that rough patch had turned into an abyss, and I had been the only one trying to pull us back from the edge. The front door opened, and I heard her footsteps before I saw her. She hesitated, her silhouette a faint outline in the doorway. For a moment, she didn't move, probably unsure if I was still here. I stayed quiet, staring ahead, not ready to face her again. But the silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until finally, she stepped into the room. "Can we talk?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, soft and fragile, like she was afraid I might shatter at the sound of it. I didn't look at her, I couldn't. Instead, I stared at the beer in my hand, the condensation beating on the glass. My fingers were numb around the bottle, but I didn't feel it. "What is there to talk about?" I asked, my voice flat, detached, as if I were talking to a stranger. She moved closer, her steps hesitant. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking, barely holding together. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I laughed, and this time it wasn't bitter. It was empty, hollow. "You keep saying that, Emily. You didn't mean for this to happen. You didn't mean for it to get this far." I shook my head, finally turning to look at her. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "But you let it happen, over and over again." She flinched at my words, like each one cut her, but I did not stop. I couldn't. "How long?" I asked, my voice quieter now, almost calm. "How long have you been lying to me?" Her eyes flickered with panic, and she wiped at her face, the tears streaming down again. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I wasn't thinking. I was lost." "Lost?" I echoed, feeling the weight of her words settle in my chest. "We've been together for years, Emily. You don't just get lost. You made a choice. Every day you made a choice to keep lying, to keep sneaking around, and now you're standing here telling me you didn't know." Her lip trembled, and she took a step closer, her hands outstretched, pleading. "I don't want to lose you. I love you. We can fix this. I'll end it with him. I swear I'll do anything." I stared at her, the woman I had once shared everything with, and I felt nothing. No rage, no heartbreak, just the cold, simple truth. "There's nothing left to fix," I said quietly, standing up from the couch, my legs heavy as if each step drained more of my energy. "I'm done, Emily. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." She reached for me, but I stepped back. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking again. "Don't walk away. I can change. We can go to therapy. We can—" "No." My voice was final, firm, and I could see the defeat in her eyes as I spoke. "I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen. I'm not going to keep fighting for something that's already broken. You destroyed us." She crumpled, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, but I didn't feel pity. Not anymore. I had already mourned the loss of our marriage long before tonight. I had spent months trying to hold on, trying to fix something that was never mine to fix. Without another word, I walked past her, toward the hallway, my heart heavy but sure. The photos on the wall seemed to blur as I passed them, memories of a life that didn't exist anymore, a life I wasn't a part of. I didn't rush as I walked down the hallway. Each step felt deliberate, like I was moving through molasses, but I wasn't in a hurry. The house was silent behind me, except for the faint sound of Emily's quiet sob echoing from the living room. I didn't look back. When I reached the bedroom, I paused at the doorway. Our bedroom. It used to be my favorite place in the world. The place where we laughed, talked about our future, made plans for everything we thought we'd build together. Now, it felt like a museum of a life that no longer belonged to me. I stood there for a moment, staring at the unmade bed, the clothes scattered on the floor, the half-open closet. It all looked so normal, so mundane, and yet nothing about it felt real anymore. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, then stepped inside. I pulled out a duffel bag from the closet, the same one I used when we'd go on weekend trips together. I remembered the last time we used it, heading to the lake for a quiet getaway. She had smiled the whole way there, holding my hand, and I had thought everything was fine. I'd thought we were fine. That was almost a year ago. How naive I had been, believing the surface, ignoring the cracks beneath. The zipper buzzed as I opened the bag, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. I began packing, tossing in clothes, shoes, and a few other essentials. It wasn't much, but I wasn't thinking about what I was leaving behind, just what I needed to get out. As I packed, my eyes wandered to the dresser. The picture frame sat there, the one of us from our wedding day, smiling at each other like we had the world in our hands. I picked it up, studying our faces, wondering how those two people had ended up here, at this moment. How everything we had promised each other had turned into this. The memories flooded back. The way she had looked at me that day, her eyes shining with love, her hand in mine, promising forever. I remembered how tightly I had held her, believing that no matter what happened, we'd always have each other. But promises weren't enough. Love wasn't enough, not when trust had been broken beyond repair. I set the picture down, face down, and continued packing. Emily's footsteps were faint, but I heard her approach before I saw her. She hovered in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her world together. Her voice was soft, fragile, barely more than a whisper. "Are you leaving?" I didn't look up. "Yeah." She stepped closer, her breath shaky, like she was afraid to speak too loudly, afraid to shatter the last threads of whatever was left between us. "Where will you go?" "I don't know," I said, throwing the last of my clothes into the bag. "But I can't stay here." The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I zipped up the duffel bag and slung it over my shoulder, finally turning to face her. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale, her hands trembling. She looked as lost as I felt, but that didn't change anything. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't want this. I never wanted to hurt you." I stared at her for a long moment. The woman I had loved, the woman I had once believed in, and maybe she was sorry. Maybe part of her regretted everything she had done. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. "I didn't want this either," I said quietly, my voice steady, but I couldn't feel the words as I spoke them. "But it's over." Her lips trembled, and for a moment I thought she might say something else. Another plea, another promise. But she didn't. She just stood there, her eyes filled with guilt, with regret. But not the kind that could fix anything. I walked past her, down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The house felt colder now, emptier, but it wasn't the house that had changed. It was me. I was leaving behind more than just a place. I was leaving behind the life I had built, the future I had believed in. When I reached the front door, I paused. My hand rested on the doorknob, but I didn't turn it right away. Instead, I took one last look around the house. The pictures on the walls, the furniture we had picked out together, the small reminders of a life that had once felt so secure, so solid. Now, it all felt like a lie. Emily was still standing in the hallway, her arms wrapped around herself, watching me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Please don't go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We've been through this so much, don't throw it all away." I met her gaze, and for the first time, I didn't feel anything. No anger, no sadness, just the quiet acceptance of what had always been inevitable. "I'm not throwing anything away, Emily," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. "You already did that." Her face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, but I didn't stay to watch. I opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. It hit me like a wave, the sudden rush of coldness, but it felt good. It felt like the first breath I had taken in months. I walked to my car, tossing the duffel bag into the back seat, and sat behind the wheel. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. For a moment, I just sat there, my hands resting on the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. I expected to feel something: rage, heartbreak, maybe even a sense of loss. But all I felt was relief. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for months, the doubt, the suspicion, the endless questions. It was gone. The storm had passed, leaving behind nothing but quiet. And that quiet felt like freedom. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life, and stared out at the empty street ahead of me. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare me. I drove away, the headlights cutting through the darkness, the house fading into the distance behind me. The past was still there, looming over my shoulder, but it felt distant now, like something that belonged to someone else. The night was calm, peaceful, as I drove through the empty streets. The weight of everything that had happened, everything I had lost, felt lighter now. It wasn't gone, not completely, but it no longer suffocated me. I didn't know what came next. I didn't have a plan, a destination, or even a clue where I would sleep that night. But none of that mattered. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The hum of the car engine filled the silence as I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets. I didn't have a destination in mind, just the need to keep moving, to put as much distance between me and the house as I could. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead in short bursts. But beyond that, everything was a blur. I didn't know how long I had been driving, but time didn't seem to matter anymore. There was no urgency, no rush to get anywhere. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't running toward anything, or away from it. I was just here, existing. The thought should have scared me, the idea that I had no plan, no home to go back to. But instead, it felt strangely liberating. All the things that had tied me down, that had weighed on me for so long, were now behind me. The uncertainty didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like possibility. The road stretched out before me, empty and quiet, but it didn't feel lonely. Not in the way I had felt in that house, with Emily just a room away, but worlds apart. This was a different kind of quiet, a peaceful kind. I pulled into a rest stop off the highway, the neon sign flickering weakly in the distance. It wasn't much, just a small convenience store and a couple of benches by the parking lot, but it was enough for tonight. I parked the car and leaned back in my seat, staring up at the dark sky through the windshield. The stars were barely visible, hidden by the glow of the city in the distance. But I didn't need to see them to know they were there. They always were, constant, unchanging, no matter what happened below. I thought back to earlier tonight, to the way Emily had looked at me, her eyes pleading, filled with regret. And for the first time, I let myself feel something. Not anger, not bitterness, but something softer, a sadness maybe. Not for what she had done, but for what we had lost, for the life we had built together, the dreams we had once shared. In the beginning, it had been so easy. We had fallen in love quickly, recklessly, like nothing else in the world mattered but us. I could still remember the way she smiled at me, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about our future, about the house we would buy, the kids we would have, the life we would build. For years I had held on to that image of us, of what we could be, if only we tried hard enough, fought hard enough. But it was a fantasy, a version of us that didn't exist anymore. Maybe it never really had. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs, and closed my eyes. The memories drifted through my mind, but they didn't hurt the way they used to. They were just that now, memories. Pieces of a life I had lived, a life I had loved, but a life that was no longer mine. It was over, and that was okay. I opened my eyes, staring out at the empty road ahead. There was nothing in front of me but darkness, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know where I was going or what I would find when I got there. But that didn't scare me anymore. Maybe that's what freedom was, letting go of the need to know, the need to control, and just being. I wasn't carrying the weight of expectations anymore, mine, Emily's, or anyone else's. All the things I had thought I needed to hold on to were gone, and in their place was the quiet, uncertain open possibility of something new. I glanced at my phone, still sitting on the passenger seat. There were no missed calls, no messages. Emily hadn't tried to reach me since I left, and I hadn't expected her to. Maybe she had finally realized what I had, that there was nothing left to say. For a moment, I thought about calling James, telling him everything. He would listen. He always did. He would offer me a place to crash for the night, some reassurance that things would get better. But as I stared at his name on the screen, I hesitated, not because I didn't want to talk to him, but because I didn't need to. Not tonight. I set the phone down, leaning back in my seat and closing my eyes again. The night air drifted in through the cracked window, cool and crisp, carrying with it the smell of pine from the trees that lined the highway. The sound of passing cars was distant, barely audible over the hum of the engine. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for, the moment I could finally breathe. The weight was gone, The doubt, the frustration, the endless cycle of questioning myself, wondering where I had gone wrong, what I could have done differently. It didn't matter anymore. Emily had made her choice, and I had made mine. There was no going back. And that was okay. The memories of our life together would always be there. I knew that. I would always carry them with me, the good, the bad, everything in between. But they no longer held me hostage. They no longer had the power to define me. I wasn't the man I had been with Emily. I wasn't the man who had spent months trying to fix something that had been broken long before I had the courage to admit it. I was something else now, something undefined, something still in the process of becoming. And for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare me. The road ahead was dark, uncertain, but it was mine. I could go anywhere, do anything, and the thought filled me with a quiet sense of peace. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't searching. I was just here. The sky above me was still dark, but somewhere in the distance, I knew the sun would rise soon. It always did. And when it did, I would be ready.